In a land where ancient prophets once walked and empires rose and crumbled like dust beneath the desert wind, a conflict began that would outlive kings, nations, and generations. A conflict that today shapes world politics, identity, religion, and human emotion more fiercely than almost any other. And long before newspapers, television, or world powers turned their eyes toward the Middle East, the seeds of this struggle were quietly being planted under centuries of migration, empire, aspiration, memory, and trauma. To understand how the Israel-Palestine conflict truly began, you must first step into a land revered by billions, a crossroads of continents, faiths, and civilizations, where every stone carries the weight of belief and every border carries the weight of history, because this place was never just geography, it was destiny, and destiny has a way of igniting human passion like fire. Before modern claims, before competing national anthems, before flags and checkpoints and decades of war, the land was ruled by the Ottoman Empire, a multi-ethnic, multi-religious giant that controlled the region for hundreds of years. And within this empire was the area Europeans would later call Palestine, home predominantly to Arab Muslims, Arab Christians, Druze communities, and a small but ancient Jewish population that had lived there continuously. Though most Jews at the time lived across Europe, where they endured centuries of discrimination, ghettoization, and periodic violence that reminded them constantly that they were outsiders in lands they had lived in for generations. But in the 19th century, the world shifted dramatically. Europe modernized, nationalism exploded, empires weakened, and suppressed peoples everywhere began to envision independent homelands. And among these rising forces was a movement that would change the Middle East forever. Zionism, the Jewish nationalist aspiration for a return to a homeland in the land of their ancestors, driven not only by religious longing, but by the harsh reality that Jews were facing increasing anti-Jewish hatred across Europe, especially in Eastern Europe and Russia, where pogroms, violent, organized massacres, brutally targeted Jewish communities. To many Jews, the message felt clear. Safety in other nations would never be guaranteed, and they began migrating in small numbers to Ottoman Palestine, purchasing land legally and founding agricultural settlements, a return that filled them with hope but worried many local Arabs, who feared that this growing movement would one day transform their society or threaten their political future. At the same time, a parallel force was rising. Arab nationalism, a cultural and political awakening among Arab communities across the Middle East, who sought independence from the weakening Ottoman Empire and feared foreign domination, especially from European colonial powers whose influence was expanding rapidly. These two nationalist dreams, Jewish and Arab, were both born from suffering and pride, but both centered on the same land. And because history is often most tragic when two peoples believe they are fighting for survival, this clash of dreams was destined to collide. When World War I erupted, the Ottoman Empire sided with Germany, and Britain saw an opportunity to reshape the Middle East to its advantage, setting into motion a web of promises so contradictory that they would echo painfully for the next century. To Arab leaders, Britain promised independence, encouraging them to revolt against the Ottomans with the hope of establishing a unified Arab state that would include Palestine. But behind closed doors, Britain was simultaneously negotiating the Sykes-Picot Agreement with France in 1916, dividing the Middle East between them as colonial zones of control, a betrayal hidden until after the war. And then, in 1917, came the Balfour Declaration, in which Britain announced support for a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, while also stating that nothing should prejudice the rights of the existing non-Jewish communities. A statement so vague and contradictory that both Jews and Arabs interpreted it according to their hopes and fears. And in making these overlapping promises, Britain laid the foundation for decades of mistrust and anger. When the war ended and the Ottoman Empire collapsed, Britain took control of Palestine through the League of Nations mandate system, and waves of Jewish immigration increased significantly, driven by hope, ideology, and the dire escalation of anti-Semitism in Europe. To Jews fleeing persecution, this immigration felt like a lifeline, a long-delayed return to a homeland where they could finally build safety and dignity. But to the Arab majority in Palestine, it felt like an existential threat, an influx supported by a colonial power that seemed poised to reshape their land without their consent. Tensions grew rapidly. Protests erupted, violence broke out in both directions, mistrust hardened, and two communities began drifting into separate worlds, each creating their own institutions, their own schools, their own defense groups. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, Britain struggled to manage the growing conflict, issuing reports, commissions, and contradictory policy shifts that pleased neither side. And in 1936, a massive Arab revolt erupted against British rule and Jewish immigration, lasting 3 years and resulting in thousands of deaths, harsh British crackdowns, and deeper bitterness. But the darkest shadow was yet to fall. The Holocaust, a genocide so vast and monstrous that the Jewish world was forever scarred, and in its aftermath, global sympathy for Jewish survivors surged, while hundreds of thousands were left homeless, seeking refuge anywhere they could. For many Jewish survivors, the idea of rebuilding their lives in Europe was impossible. The continent had become a place of ghosts, and so the dream of a homeland became not just nationalistic, but deeply emotional, a matter of survival. And as Jewish refugees attempted to reach Palestine, Britain, fearing further unrest, began restricting immigration, a move that angered Jews worldwide and pushed Zionist resistance groups to launch attacks against British forces, turning the land into a battleground of empire, survival, and resistance. By 1947, Britain announced it could no longer manage the crisis and handed the issue to the United Nations, which proposed the partition plan, dividing Palestine into 2 states, one Jewish and one Arab, with Jerusalem under international control. Jewish leaders accepted the plan as a painful but necessary compromise, a chance at statehood after centuries of exile and suffering, but Arab leaders rejected it, arguing that it violated the rights of the indigenous Arab majority and granted too much land to the Jewish minority. When Britain withdrew in 1948, and the Jewish leadership declared the establishment of the State of Israel, neighboring Arab states invaded, launching the First Arab-Israeli War, a conflict that reshaped everything. Israel won and expanded its territory beyond the UN plan, while over 700,000 Palestinian Arabs fled or were expelled from their homes, an event Palestinians call the Nakba, the catastrophe, a defining trauma that lives at the core of Palestinian identity. At the same time, in a parallel tragedy often forgotten by the world, roughly the same number of Jews were expelled or forced to flee from Arab countries where tensions were rising, and many resettled in Israel, creating twin narratives of displacement, grief, and loss. By the time armistice lines were drawn in 1949, Israel controlled the majority of the territory. Jordan held the West Bank and East Jerusalem, Egypt controlled Gaza, and no Palestinian state was created, leaving the Palestinian people stateless, fragmented, and increasingly desperate, while Israel, surrounded by hostile neighbors, felt besieged and fought to survive in a region that rejected its existence. The stage was set for decades of war, occupation, uprising, and shattered peace attempts. But to understand the next chapters, we must first understand that these two peoples were now bound together by trauma, history, and geography, each seeing themselves as fighting for survival, each viewing the same events through a completely different moral lens, each grieving losses the other side struggled to fully acknowledge. And from this crucible of identity and suffering emerged one of the most enduring conflicts the modern world has ever seen. In the years that followed the 1948 war, the Middle East entered a tense and uneasy era defined by shifting alliances, rising nationalism, and the lingering wounds of displacement. And as new nations across the region gained independence from colonial rule, the Palestinian cause became a symbol of resistance against Western influence, while Israel struggled to build a stable society surrounded by countries that refused to recognize its existence. Between these political storms were real people, families living in refugee camps, soldiers at borders that could erupt at any moment, children growing up with stories of loss, sacrifice, and injustice, each generation inheriting a narrative shaped by pain, survival, and memory. By the mid-20th century, Palestinian nationalism crystallized more clearly than ever before, taking shape through grassroots resistance and political movements that sought to restore the land and identity that had been torn apart. And in 1964, the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, was formed, initially more symbolic than powerful, but destined to become the heart of Palestinian political identity, especially under the leadership of Yasser Arafat, whose charisma and determination made him both a hero to many Palestinians and a controversial figure in the West. But history once again took a dramatic and violent turn in 1967, during the Six-Day War, when tensions between Israel and its neighbors, Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, escalated into a stunning and decisive conflict that lasted less than a week, ending with Israel capturing the West Bank, Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem, Sinai Peninsula, and Golan Heights, radically transforming the map and the nature of the conflict. Israel suddenly found itself controlling territories inhabited by more than 1 million Palestinians, and while some Israelis saw these lands as vital for security or part of biblical heritage, Palestinians viewed the occupation as the beginning of a new era of dispossession. And within this moment, something irreversible had happened. The conflict was no longer just between nations, but between a military power and a stateless people yearning for sovereignty. The aftermath of 1967 reshaped everything: the geography, the politics, the psychology of the region. And as Israel began establishing settlements in the West Bank and Gaza, the stage was set for decades of tension over borders, resources, rights, and identity. The 1970s and 1980s brought wars in Lebanon, Palestinian guerrilla operations from neighboring countries, hijackings that grabbed global attention, Israeli military reprisals, and internal divides within Palestinian movements, as well as shifting international attitudes that increasingly recognized the Palestinian struggle as a fight for self-determination. And then, in 1987, something unexpected happened from deep within the occupied territories. An uprising that was not planned by political leaders, but erupted from ordinary people overwhelmed by years of frustration, checkpoints, economic hardship, and humiliation. The First Intifada, a spontaneous movement of protests, strikes, boycotts, and clashes that drew the world's attention to the lived reality of Palestinians under occupation, and forced Israel to confront a profound truth: military power alone could not silence a people's longing for nationhood. The images of teenagers throwing stones at tanks became iconic, symbolizing a heartbreaking asymmetry that challenged international perceptions of the conflict. While inside Israel, the uprising triggered debate, soul-searching, and disagreement over how the conflict should be resolved. The First Intifada eventually pushed both sides toward negotiations, leading to the bold and historic Oslo Accords in the early 1990s, where Israeli and Palestinian leaders met, shook hands, and for a moment, the world believed peace was finally within reach. The Accords created the Palestinian Authority, gave Palestinians limited self-rule in parts of the West Bank and Gaza, and were built on the promise that negotiations would gradually resolve the major issues: borders, settlements, Jerusalem, refugees, security. But Oslo was fragile from the start, attacked by extremists on both sides who feared compromise, and undone by mistrust, political paralysis, and violence. The assassination of Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin by a Jewish extremist in 1995 shattered the momentum, and by the early 2000s, the dream of peace collapsed entirely with the eruption of the Second Intifada, far deadlier and more destructive than the first, marked by suicide bombings, heavy Israeli military operations, curfews, checkpoints, and the construction of a separation barrier that reshaped the geography and psychology of the region, severing neighborhoods, families, and farmlands. This period left deep scars: Israelis traumatized by relentless attacks in city streets, buses, and restaurants, and Palestinians devastated by overwhelming force, destroyed infrastructure, mass arrests, and the tightening of movement restrictions. And these years hardened attitudes, reduced trust to almost nothing, and produced political shifts that would define the conflict for decades. By 2006, new fractures emerged within Palestinian politics when Hamas, an Islamist movement opposed to Israel's existence, won legislative elections. leading to a violent split between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, ultimately leaving Hamas in control of Gaza and the PA governing parts of the West Bank under President Mahmoud Abbas. The split created two Palestinian worlds: Gaza, suffering from blockades, wars, and isolation, and the West Bank, caught in an endless cycle of negotiations, settlement expansion, and diminishing hope. And as time passed, many Palestinians felt their dream of statehood slipping further away, while Israelis grew increasingly skeptical that any Palestinian leadership could deliver peace or prevent attacks. Repeated wars between Israel and Hamas, especially in 2008, 2009, 2012, 2014, and beyond, inflicted enormous suffering, flattening neighborhoods in Gaza, causing civilian casualties on both sides, and reinforcing a cycle where each side viewed the other as the aggressor and themselves as acting in self-defense. International actors tried repeatedly to mediate, but each attempt stumbled on the same core issues: Israel's security concerns, Palestinian demands for sovereignty, the status of Jerusalem, the right of return for refugees, the future of settlements, and the deep emotional scars of a century of conflict. To Israelis, the world often failed to grasp the existential fear rooted in centuries of persecution, the trauma of the Holocaust, and the security threats they faced in a region where many groups still rejected Israel's right to exist. To Palestinians, the world often ignored the pain of occupation, statelessness, checkpoints, demolitions, settlements, lost homes, and the feeling of being a people denied their rights and dignity. These are not just political positions. They are emotional realities inherited through families, reinforced through experience, and used by leaders to justify decisions that often perpetuate the status quo. As the 21st century progressed, the conflict became a symbol of global polarization, argued passionately on college campuses, in parliaments, in social media, and in diplomatic chambers. Yet the voices of ordinary people living the conflict daily were often lost in the noise. Today, Israel is a powerful, technologically advanced state with deep global alliances, while Palestinians remain divided, with Gaza trapped in cycles of war and blockade, and the West Bank fragmented by checkpoints and settlements. And despite occasional negotiations or ceasefire talks, the ultimate questions, statehood, identity, borders, peace, remain painfully unresolved. And yet, beneath the politics and the propaganda, beneath the headlines and the history books, the human reality endures. Two peoples shaped by trauma, bound to the same land, haunted by the past, fearful for the future, and trapped in a conflict that neither side can escape, because identity, memory, and belonging are not easily rewritten. Whether peace will ever come is a question history cannot answer, because history only explains how we arrived here, not how we leave. But by understanding the origins, by seeing the full story of promises made and broken, migrations and memories, survival and loss, we come closer to seeing the humanity behind the conflict. And maybe, in that understanding, lies the faintest glimmer of a different future. And if you want more powerful true stories, more untold truths buried beneath centuries of conflict, and more deep explorations of the past that shaped our world in ways we rarely understand, then make sure you subscribe to Dark History Files, where the shadows of yesterday reveal the secrets of tomorrow.